It's probably time to get started. Got my pipe, some beer. Now we're ready. Well, welcome to my first lecture. You guys know me as Lex. That's my name, Lex White. Um, I am intending to speak on Pythagoras, sacred geometry, and how it relates to the creation story of Genesis 1 and Kabbalah. Um, Let me know in the Discord if I I'm just looking at the lecture schedule channel. If you can't hear anything or see anything, um, just let me know so that I can correct it. I see some people are typing there, so okay. All right. Well, let me go over just a few of my source materials before I get started. I Let me see. I can turn up the volume. Is that better? Okay. Yeah, this is a vocal mic, so it's meant for performing close. So, a few of my source materials. Um, of course, I guess the most important one is the Bible. This is a Masonic edition that is just it's really just the King James. There's nothing particularly different about it. It has some different things for different degrees, but the text of the Bible itself is just the King James version. King James was famously a Mason, so I guess that's why they like his version. I like R.A. Kaplan's versions of the Sefer Yetzirah. He does it quite a lot of Kabbalistic stuff. He had a PhD in physics, I believe. Very interesting guy. I think he passed away relatively young, which is a shame. But he had the Sefer Yetzirah and the Bahir, the Illumination, which is this is probably the oldest textbook to Kabbalah, and people say that that even Abraham had the Sefer Yetzirah, but obviously that's a mythical history. And then one of my favorite books is Manly P. Hall's The Secret Teachings of All Ages. You can see I've worn this one out, tore it, taped it. It's um, it's one of the best books on general occult topics that you can find. Um, this one it has a lot about Pythagoras, which is what we're going to be getting into. Um, Pythagoras, he was a he was kind of a man of mystery. There's not a lot known um, about his life. Actually, he was a kind of a mythical figure or legendary figure, but he attributed to him are a lot of advancements in early mathematics and also the invention of essentially our modern musical theory. The Pythagorean comma is a system where we can go through and look at where we can separate the tones so that, for example, it paved the way for the even tempering system of the Baroque period, where we were able to actually play in all 12 keys equally out of tune so that you could play them without retuning the instrument. That's a really important stuff. Obviously, everyone knows the Pythagorean theorem. That's we're all taught that as kids. Um, I mean, just in elementary school, really, you kind of learn that. But his teachings about geometry are fundamental to our modern understanding. They created in Greece a system of numbers that was really a pseudo religious system. It's very interesting when you take a look at some of the things that they were doing. They they believed that the entirety of the entirety of the universe's issues could be seen through this figure here, the tetractys. And the tetractys is essentially just a triangle made up of dots, but it's 10 dots. The Pythagoreans believed that in the number 10 was all of the mysteries and secrets of nature, that all numbers could be derived from the first 10 numbers and almost even the first four numbers. They so when I say the first four numbers, you can see that the tetractys is a stack of dots. There's one, two, three, and four. And then if you add them all together, it makes 10. So in those first four numbers, one, two, three, four, you have wrapped up the mysteries of the universe. Um, in the number one, they saw the monad. They almost actually didn't even consider one to be a number. It was so important and fundamental to the universe um, that it wasn't really, it had no numerical properties at all. It was um, it was the infinite point. So when you have if you had a zero dimensional point, it essentially has no length, width, height. It has nothing. It's just one dot that's infinitely small. And by nature of being infinitely small, it's also infinitely large. In in that, it contains really everything. And then that ends up expanding into the duad, which the Pythagoreans saw as the beginning of evil. The beginning of evil was the separation of things from one into two. Uh, Obviously, we have many dualistic systems, Zoroastrianism and Catharism. You know, various Gnostic teachings were very dualistic, but the duad is uh, is where the universe really began to expand. They they saw it as being the beginning of the sane universe. But when you added the monad to the duad, you got the triad. The triad was the true divine beginning of the universe where there was actual stability. As it's well known, the tripod is basically one of the most stable, simple structures that you can create. And so they revered this structure of the triad, which we see today when Christians revere the Trinity. Even the Trinity has manifestations in even Hinduism. When you have Vishnu, Brahma, Shiva, there's various manifestations of the Trinity is throughout throughout the world, essentially, because people realize that the interplay of three forces, the interplay of three numbers, was essentially a um, valuable and basic idea. It appears throughout nature. Things grow in threes. They they are worked in threes, and the number three essentially holds the key to the number five for the golden ratio. The golden rectangle is a ratio of these three. It can infinitely be broken down into three constituent parts. that will then have the same dimensions as the greater whole, and it can be broken down further. Um, those ideas convinced the Pythagoreans of the divinity of the number three. When then the number four they saw as being representative of the created world. The you have the four, cardinal directions. You have the four elements. You have um, essentially the base the base of reality is four-sided. The square is the base, and you can see this um, in the mystery of the pyramids. Pythagoras himself was said to have been initiated in the pyramids at Giza. The he definitely traveled and lived in Egypt. Supposedly, he was even taken in captivity to Babylon and was inducted into the initiatic traditions of the Chaldeans, and possibly even was a contemporary of Zoroaster, uh, Zarathustra, the famous Persian mystic or god man. He then traveled back, and actually in southern Italy, in the Greek colony of Croton, he essentially founded his school, which had a notorious initiation practice of requiring people to stay absolutely silent for a year and to prove their loyalty. Um, they, it was absolutely necessary that they follow all orders, and it was a very strict practice that they had. Kind of, they had some weird things, like for example, you couldn't eat beans. Pythagoras thought that beans were a kind of like an embryo. They reminded him of the human embryo, and so he thought you ought not to eat them. Well, Pythagoras and the structure of the Tetractys, they represent a symbolic representation of these basic geometrical and numerical ideas. Um, as you can see in this um, lower image there, from the Tetractys, you can derive the cube and the seal of Solomon. You can use it uh, to really understand all of these aspects of geometry. It contains within it many of the symbols that are used. The the basic um, progression of creation was seen to have been a geometric progression. And as you can see here, uh, we have a dot, a line, a triangle, and then we have a tetrahedron. That is, first we have 0 dimensions. That's the point. Then we have 1 dimension, which is a line. Uh, then we have 2 dimensions. So we have a line that has width and something that has length. And when we go into 3 dimensions, then we add height. That's a simple way of looking at it. The Because of that, they were able to derive the structures of the Platonic solids. So, we have the sphere, the tetrahedron, the cube. Um, I always forget the name of that one. Well, we have the icosahedron and the dodecahedron down here. But what is the name of that one? I always remember it as an 8-sided die. That's you know, in high school, we played a lot of Dungeons and Dragons, and it made it made sense. We were always playing with these platonic solids, but they saw those solids as being fundamental to the structure of creation, and we can see that they're hidden in a certain sense or derivable from just a basic mathematical understanding. the when we talk about how this relates to um, the story in Genesis and Kabbalah, the the there was a common usage of the tetragrammaton, which is the letters YHVH or Yud He Wah He, um, the spell Yahweh, where, for example, you can see them here written in a tetractys, and at the bottom they interpolated shin in the middle to make the word Yahashua or Yeshua, um, which is the name of Christ. That the and shin is one of the fundamental letters, one of the three mothers of Hebrew, and so people interpreted that with a lot of symbolic weight. The uh, the Tetragrammaton mystery has a lot to do with this concept of geometrical progression. It itself begins with the letter Yud, which is a single point. Um, it's written kind of like an apostrophe, but it represents a single point. Um, there's in Hebrew there are lots and lots of representations of there are lots of symbolic meanings within the letters. That every letter has a numerical value, but it also has a basic meaning. Aleph means ox, for example. Um, Yud is seen as being the it's seen as being like the male organ, you know, but that is indicative of its creative capacity. So, in this holy name, we have the beginning of a single point, and then there are many interpretations. For example, one of our friends on our Discord server shared that it YHVH it can be used to create the body of a man with two arms, two legs, having a torso and a head. Um, I personally have always interpreted it as being representative of the sound of breathing, the the yud being the single point or a sound of arrival. It could be a clap or a snap kind of thing, and then the first, and then wah, and then and it becomes this process of breathing in and breathing out that begins the universe. That's the when when a lot of the rabbinical scholars study Genesis, they they read that into the first act of creation. There's a lot of things in Hebrew that people read as being things are implied or can be inferred by the reader, which they find to be significant. The I big old copy of Genesis here. Um, in the beginning, God created heaven and the earth. Um, really, heaven should probably be plural. In Hebrew, it's shemayim, which is a plural word. But they see it significant as in the beginning, we have a beginning that's set out. God, God in this case is Elohim. Um, some of the alternative uh, ways of reading the Hebrew of this structure or the Hebrew of this sentence, uh, instead of being rendered into English as in the beginning God created the heaven and the earth, it is rendered as in the beginning created, in the beginning he created, the he being inferred. In the beginning created Elohim and the heaven and the earth. Elohim is a plural word, which has often been taken to mean like, oh, there were many gods or it was a family of gods. But The traditional Kabbalistic view is that Elohim is representative of the powers of creation, which are multiple. Um, it's a title of which it represents the powers of God as they act in the universe. The God himself does not have anything that can be attributed as a describing factor. Nothing can be described about God. God only has this this ineffable, almost completely transcendent nature. And when God creates, then he has to almost remove himself. And we use the word he, but in this sense, God has no gender or is both male and female. As it says later, when God creates man, God creates them in his own image and then says, and male and female, he created them. So, how could he create them in his own image, uh, male and female, if he didn't have male and female as his image? He had to have had both natures. So, there's really a lot of linguistic things that we take as shortcuts because language is a very inaccurate. Uh, we just have to live with the inaccuracies of our linguistic capabilities. But here we have, in the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. This is taken to mean that he created this mental space, which is the heavens, and then a space of matter, which is the earth. It could also be taken to mean that he created space and substance, uh, heavens being then space, and then earth being substance. In Genesis, we start to see that there's a kind of numerical code that's being used. Um, God, Elohim, does has 32 representations and actions within Genesis 1. In the Sefer Yetzirah, the very first beginning of the Sefer Yetzirah says, with 32 mystical paths of wisdom engraved Yah, the Lord of hosts, the God of Israel, the living God, King of the universe, etc. And he created his universe with 3 books, with text, with number, and with communication. The 32 paths of wisdom are the 32 times that God's name is mentioned in Genesis. Um, Elohim, God's name, his title Elohim is mentioned in Genesis 32 times. Uh, that is can be further broken down into 10 sayings, times when God says something, and God always creates by speaking. That's what we see in Genesis, is that God creates when he speaks. Um, and then there's 22 times of further actions. Um, as we see from, and he created his universe with 3 books in the Sefer Yetzirah, with text, with number. The Hebrew alphabet has 22 letters, and there are, like the Tetractys says, there are 10 numbers. There's 10 fundamental numbers. This is adding up to 32. And then with communication means, you have to organize those. You have to organize them into something that can be communicated, which is what we see. The traditional Kabbalistic interpretation would be that that's what we see with the Torah. The Torah that we have, the book of Genesis and Exodus and Deuteronomy, Leviticus, etc., is not the true Torah, but a lower dimensional manifestation that is descended to us and is our levels ability to perceive the Torah. That is the communication that created the universe. They take it as being a literal encoded text through which you can you can look at what's written in the Torah, and from the arrangement of the letters, you can derive um, universal truths about how the world was created, because those letters are literal representations of the arrangement of information at the beginning. The I doubt that we'll be able to go through all of the different meanings of Genesis today, just Genesis 1, because it is one of the most profound texts that on its surface is, you think, oh well, it's just it's kind of silly because it doesn't really match what our scientific perspective is of how creation should have happened. Um, what it doesn't mention a big bang or billions and billions of years. It talks about, oh, there's 7 days, 7 days of creation. And then we think, interpreting that literally, we think, oh, that's doesn't make any sense. um, but as these rabbis knew, there are many, many layers of meaning through everything that is written in Scripture. There's the surface meaning, and then there's a metaphorical or allegorical level, and then in the uh, in the metaphorical and allegorical meanings, there are even deeper meanings that you can take by comparing those passages to other passages. And then the there's the meaning that Kabbalah is really the most interested in, which is the secret mystical meaning of the arrangement of the words, the arrangement of the letters, their numerical values, their um, their secret interpretations. And it's when we get into those that we start to see that these the words that are written in Genesis 1 are extremely profound. Um, Kabbalah itself just means tradition, and it is the tradition of basically interpreting text to be interpreting texts to say, what are the secret meanings of this. It's a school tradition that used to be for rabbis who were over the age of 40 and were married and had children and things. Then they could be inducted into this way of understanding the scriptures. This was it was a secret school essentially for a very long time, and only basically after the Holocaust did the international community of the Jews, they said, this will be lost if we don't do something to preserve it. And so, in order to preserve it, they essentially started to publish things where you can actually, it was rare to find any of these texts translated or explained, um, especially to Gentiles like me, uh, in before World War II. But after World War II, in order to preserve that knowledge, it was necessary to go and spread it around. So just from thinking about these 32 paths of wisdom, we see 10 numbers, 22 letters, uh, and we also see a geometrical value. When we look at the apexes of these different, as we were looking at the dot, the line, square, um, then we end up in 3 dimensions. And if we continue to go, uh, we'll have uh, we'll have higher dimensional figures. The If you have a 2 dimensional or an object, the 0 dimensional version of a cube is a dot. It's yud. It has 2 to the 0 apexes, which is 1. It has 1 apex. It is itself just that. A line has 2 to the 1 apexes, so it has 2 apexes, one here, one here. And then a square has 2 to the second, basically 2 to the second dimension apexes, four, 1, 2, 3, 4. And then a cube has 2 to the third, so it has eight. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. And then a four-dimensional cube has 16. It's 2 to the fourth. And a five-dimensional cube has 32. It's 2 to the fifth. Um, there are 32 apexes, corners in a five-dimensional cube. Um, this is uh, this is really important because when we talk about our reality as encompassing multidimensional spaces, uh, we start to really enter into the area where we can say um, things that appear impossible can really be in truth real. It's just that they have a hyperdimensional meaning that we can't interpret through 3 dimensions. That's a very important concept in all of this. For example, if if we lived in a 2 dimensional world and we had we saw a sphere, a 3 dimensional sphere pass through our world, it would begin as just a point and it would become a widening circle. We would just see this circle widen and then it would shrink until it was just a point again. And then when it was down here, it would disappear. We wouldn't see anything anymore. And so it would appear to us that this thing just appeared and then disappeared. It appeared, it grew, it shrank, and then disappeared. And we would say, well, how is that possible? Things can't just appear and disappear. But it didn't actually disappear. It just moved into a dimensional space that we couldn't comprehend. The same thing really happens in 4 dimensions. Uh, if we think of the fourth dimension as being time, we can render 4 dimensional objects in 3 dimensions by showing them through time. That doesn't necessarily mean that time is the fourth dimension, but it can be understood as these 4 dimension as a 4 dimensional object by showing a 3 dimensional object moving through time. Just like in order for us to see a sphere in 2 dimensions, we have to let it move through time in order for us to see all of it. Otherwise, we just see a cross section. So in a 4 dimensional object in 3 dimensions, we just see a cross section in any particular point in time. It appears to be a 3 dimensional object, but it as it moves and changes, it can show these what appear to us to be radically weird changes um, that are inexplicable, but they it's just that they're coming from a hyperdimensional space. If we take even human beings as being 4 dimensional, you can think that every space that you've ever occupied in previous points of time almost stretches out like a snake or a dragon or something behind you. One of the Chinese dragons, it stretches out behind you, um, back into back into the womb of your mother in the hospital, and then she stretches back to the womb of her mother in the hospital, and etc. You can see that almost you would see these huge branching um, lines going back into the past if you were able to render everything all at once. You would see humanity almost like a very gnarled kind of tree where as it continues, it just keeps branching out. This this tree, I mean, it goes back to the beginning of the universe and the beginning of our species, and goes back to the beginning of life on Earth, and then life on Earth. Earth itself has its occupying spaces, and it could be drawn as a chain of Earths going back into the past until ultimately you arrive back at this one point, the Yud point of the Tetragrammaton, from which all things are springing. Um, to me, that's fascinating because using time, you can essentially render all things as four-dimensional objects that we just see cross sections of. This right here is just a cross section of me, the four-dimensional me, uh, at this moment, and then it continues in this direction and that direction, goes out the door, comes back in. Every time I go to the store, make a new a new curling branch. Um, and then when you deal with five dimensions, then in three dimensions, we're only seeing cross sections of cross sections, um, which is where things really start to be confusing. But the implications of that are pretty broad, and we can get into them in a little bit. I want to go over a little bit of how this information is encoded in Genesis. Um, Here I have this is a this Sefer Yetzirah, Aryeh Kaplan's version is fantastic because it has this things like this, where this is a table that shows all 32 actions of God. It relates them to a Hebrew letter, um, or if it is a number, it relates them to a Sephiroth on a tree of life, which is a 10 pointed figure. This is it on the cover here. As people are pretty familiar with this, I'm sure, if they're interested in this kind of thing. Um, there's other ways to represent it. If you look at, if you just Google five-dimensional hypercube animation, you'll see that this figure actually is just a cross section of a five-dimensional hypercube as it's rendered through time. We can only render five-dimensional objects or four-dimensional objects as animations because, like I said, in an individual moment it's only a cross section, and in a five-dimensional case it's a cross section of a cross section. So in order for us to see them, we have to see it moving through time. This is just one slice of what the actual tree of life is in five dimensions, but this is another way that it's represented with the tail down here. But the importance of these 32 paths starts to become clear when you see that each one of them has a passage and is one action of Elohim, the plural word, which they take to mean Elohim is the 32 paths of wisdom. Elohim is the 32 ways that Yahweh engraved into the world. And so we have in the beginning God created, which is the Sephiroth of the crown, Keter. Then the Spirit of God moved on the face of the waters. God said, "Let there be light." God saw the light that it was good. God divided between the light and darkness. God called the light day. God said, "Let there be a firmament." God made the firmament. God called the firmament heaven. God said, "Let the waters be gathered." God called the dry land earth, and so on. All of these things, I invite you to just read Genesis 1 again when you're thinking about these things, thinking about the deeper meanings of each of these individual things. Um, even just looking at these very first couple lines, we have these very profound meanings that we can uncover. We already went through, in the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. The second line, and the earth was without form and void. That can be sometimes translated as the earth was chaos and nothingness, chaos and desolation, chaos and void, without form and void. The words in Hebrew are tohu and bohu. Um, very interesting, uh, very interesting words, because tohu, the word that we say means without form, or or chaos. Uh, Sometimes can be translated as astonishment or utterly confounding. This is the earth was utterly confounding, meaning that our minds our minds couldn't comprehend what the earth was like. Um, and the earth was without form means that when they're talking about this, um, the commentaries say that chaos is the state in which things could exist. All of the materials then are necessary for existence are there, but but there is no information. No information has been gathered yet. There is no signal. There's only noise. It's pure noise. Um, and then when it said that it was void, it's empty. No, nothing has been imparted unto it yet. There's nothing that's been given to it. Uh, there's really fascinating interpretations of this whole without form and void concept. The One of the core Kabbalistic ideas of creation has to do with this concept of constriction. And if we remember what I had just read in the beginning of the very first chapter of the Sefer Yetzirah, it says, with 32 mystical paths of wisdom engraved Yah. Uh, that can mean that Yah engraved with these 32 paths. It can also mean that these 32 paths engraved Yah um, into the universe. So there's a kind of created and creating aspect to that, depending on the translation. But engraving is an important distinction there because it doesn't say there's a difference between writing and engraving. When you write something, obviously in the ancient times they really didn't write; they mostly engraved. But in order to engrave something, you remove material. You carve channels in something in order to make cuneiform or Hebrew. You are removing material, and that the removed material is what allows for meaning to take place. Whereas if you write something, then you're putting material onto something to create meaning. The the fascinating part of that is that it it has this idea which they call constriction or tzimtzum, um, which is uh, which is the idea that God was perfectly unified. He was that one point which was infinitely small, infinitely large, had no dimensions whatsoever. So it was infinite. Nothing can be said about it. It was so perfect and unified that that in order to, if you make any defining statement about it at all, any differentiation would actually diminish it. And so when we say that God engraved um, with these 32 paths, God engraved out of his own being. He constricted his light in order to create a void. So when the earth was without form and void, God withdrew himself to create a cavernous space, uh, the space that's the infinite, um, infinitely bounded space that we know as outer space. One imagines, though it could be an even greater thing than that. But in order to fill something, in order to create something and to have space worth filling, he had to first engrave out of himself space and constrict himself so that uh, if so that his own being didn't take over whatever it was, because his power was so great that if he still was in creation completely, then creation couldn't really exist separately. So, wanting to create a separate creation, he had to constrict his own light, and then that's when we see and the earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep. Uh, the Bahir mentions that um, God created. Soon, God will say, "Let there be light," but it mentions darkness before light uh, because God didn't have to speak to create light or to create darkness. Um, he just had to withdraw himself and then think. Uh, Darkness was created by thinking, uh, not by speaking, because he didn't have to impart anything. He wasn't creating. When he speaks, he creates something from nothing. When if he's not speaking, then he's creating something from something. So darkness is created something from something, and the basic thing that it's created from is himself. He engraved out this darkness, which is creating something from himself. Uh, I always thought that was a pretty fascinating point. Um, that's the reason why darkness comes first. Another distinction that they make in Hebrew is between words for created and words for make. If God creates something, that means that he begins it. That doesn't mean that it's completed. When God creates, he begins the process, and then but when God makes, when you make something, um, you have completed the process. You've made it to its final form, and the way that that ends up being relevant is in in Psalms, for example. It says that God created evil and made and makes peace. God creates evil and makes peace. And so people read that and say, well, what the hell does that mean? Uh, he creates evil and he makes peace, but how can he make peace if he's creating evil? Uh, that concept goes back to this idea of chaos. That's Chaos is seen as being the root of evil, but what is chaos? Like we were saying, it's noise with no signal. It is raw material only. It has no meaning. It has no greater meaning. Has no imparted meaning. It only has basic potential and form. So God creates evil, meaning that he brings into existence raw materials, but he makes peace. So he brings in these raw materials, this chaos. The earth was without form, was chaos. Um, he brings in these raw materials, which are evil because they don't have any meaning. Um, and then he makes them into peace. They are eventually, through the process of creation, transformed from being mere raw materials into being something of worth. And that's actually a really an interesting point. Is that in Hebrew the the numerical, if you want to write the number 32 in Hebrew, it's lamed bet. Um, that's the number 32. It has a numerical value of 32, and that word is lev. Bet is the first letter of the Torah, which is in Bereshith in the beginning, and then Lamed is the last letter of the Torah, which is in the word Israel. Um, and if if you take those in that order, Lamed Bet, if you're back here and you have Lamed, and then you bring it up here and you have Bet, and you read it right to left, it's The word that it spells is lev, which means heart, and um, and it's famously said that the Torah, the true Torah, is written upon the heart, that which has the value of 32. There's also other meanings of 32 in the human body. For example, there's 31 nervous branch pathways that come off the spine, and then there's a 32nd path, which is the cranial complex of nerves. We have 33 vertebrae. Uh, I think if you count the coccyx, it's 33. The which is 32 plus God, or and if you're familiar with Kundalini or any of these other kind of spinal images of enlightenment having to do with the elevation of spinal energies, this starts to make a whole lot of sense. What they're saying about 32 paths of wisdom, they're saying that these 32 paths of wisdom are called Elohim, and man is created in the image of Elohim, not in the image of Yahweh. Uh, though that could also be true, it's just that each one of these names, the names that are given to God, are not themselves God, but they're titles of God acting in certain contexts. And so the context of Elohim is these creative values that are enumerated in the 32 acts of creation in Genesis, the 32 acts of God, of Elohim. And those are reflected in the human body, in our nervous system. Pretty interesting stuff. We even have a reflection in the next line where it says, and the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters. But in Hebrew, the word Spirit of God, Ruach HaKodesh, is HaKodesh. My Hebrew is terrible, by the way. I don't really have any pronunciation training at all at it, so just your interpretation is probably as good as mine. But Ruach means breath. It says Spirit of God, but it also means breath or wind. And so if we think that idea of the tetragrammaton being the sound of breathing, the breath of God moved on the face of the waters. And what happens when you move breath on the face of water? I don't know if you can see that, but you can create ripples in the liquid there. You're creating these vibratory patterns, waves. So when we see God creating, the very first time that God explicitly says something is the very next line, and God said, "Let there be light." God's breath moved upon the face of the waters, creating a wave. And what is speaking? It's the creation of waves in the air. We create air waves. Our creative faculty is in our voice, in that we our ability to translate thought into the physical world comes through our ability to speak. Through that, we directly translate whatever we can think into physical vibration. This is what God does, and the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters. And the breath of God moved upon the face of the waters, and God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. It's interesting here that it says, "And there was light," the past tense. We were talking about this the other day, that God says, "Let there be light," and there was light. It's not necessarily like, oh, now there's suddenly light. It's like he creates his creation. It can be retroactive, even, that there was light and there is light and there will be light. because at some point he decided, let there be light. And then at all points, this creation is taking place almost outside of time. Um, it's being spiritually engraved, which is a important idea. There's this idea that God created everything spiritually before he actually physically he created the blueprint for everything before it actually physically became reality. And um, in the rabbinical traditions, um, that blueprint is called the Torah. It God is said to have consulted the Torah as he was creating, and that what that means is that the Torah is the blueprint that he made, and as he's building it, he consults the Torah again and again, and then the text that we have is not itself the true Torah, but a manifestation of the Torah. The true Torah is written on the heart and is accessed on the heart. And so Kabbalists will talk about descending into the chambers of the heart and using the Merkabah vehicle um, to ascend to heaven by descending into the chambers of the heart. So what they're doing is they're directly accessing the Torah or directly accessing the blueprint of reality rather than reading the book. The book is just a manifestation of the Torah that we have on our level, but there are higher and higher manifestations of the Torah until there's the absolute Torah, which is the scaffolding of the entire universe. It's the entire backbone structure of the universe. Uh, so when we see things in here in the text, they have a very deep meaning to Kabbalists because they they themselves are indicative of this scaffolding. These words themselves, these words that I'm reading off of this page, are not themselves the scaffolding. They're the manifestation and indication of the scaffolding that we have, particularly when we're reading a translation even more removed from Hebrew. Um, but the rest of these processes, I mean, we could really go in and break down Genesis 1 a lot. But I invite you to do that yourself based on what we're talking about here. I just want to touch on a few more things, and I don't want to keep rambling on forever. But when let's talk about the significance of the tree of life and the significance of it being 5-dimensional. The In the creation story of Genesis 2, there's basically two creation stories in Genesis. There's Genesis 1, which you could see as the spiritual creation, and then there's Genesis 2, which is more concerned with Adam and Eve and the creation of man. The creation of Adam and Eve is really pretty fascinating. After they eat from the tree of knowledge of good and evil, let me see if I can just read it. Let's see. I guess it must be in chapter 3. And the Lord God said, this time when it says the Lord God, I believe it's Yahweh, because when it says the Lord in the King James version, generally it's Adonai, which is Adonai is the pronunciation of, so that you don't end up saying God all the time, because the Tetragrammaton name, is too powerful to besmirch with common speech. And the Lord God said, behold, the man is become as one of us to know good and evil. And now, lest he put forth his hand and take also of the tree of life and eat and live forever. Um, so we can see that the tree of life is the key to what you could say is eternal life, which is the goal of alchemists and all kinds of occult practitioners, is to eventually achieve eternal life. The tree of life itself is, like we were talking about, it is the Sephiroth tree, this figure with 32 apexes and 10 centers called Sephiroth. We can get into the meaning of Sephiroth at a later date, the particular meanings of them, because they're each pretty deep subjects in and of themselves. But suffice it to say that this structure here, the tree of life, is seen as being, in Genesis 1, the literal manifestation of the powers of creation. And it is being said in Genesis 3, that I was just reading, that I believe it's 3:22, that mankind, or Adam, could conceivably gain the power of the tree of life and then would become like God. It doesn't mean would become God, but many people, when they talk about Christians talk about theosis, for example, it's becoming like God. The goal is to become more and more like God every passing moment, every passing day, to continually try to emulate their heavenly Father in all things, And that process of becoming like God is the process of understanding what is meant by the tree of life, and really processing the meaning of this five-dimensional figure. We can also see the 5 dimensions here in the fact that there's 10 Sephiroth, which each one of them represents the two opposite pairs of different planes, different lines. So we have length, and then we have this point, this point. We have width, this point, and this point. We have height, we have these 2 points. And then we have something at 90-degree angles to all of those, which we'll say is time. And then we have something at 90-degree angles to that, which has points, which are the traditional interpretation is that the 5th dimension of the tree of life is what's called a dimension of spirit, or the dimension of good and evil. That's what, when they ate from the tree of life, Adam and Eve gained the knowledge of good and evil. They suddenly, and that's when time began too. That's when they suddenly became subject to death. They were not previously subject to death. But after eating from the tree, they suddenly knew good and evil, and they suddenly knew. Kabbalists even say that it was the beginning of space, the physical space, that it suddenly came into existence with this. So this 5-dimensional figure is these 5 axes: the 3 axes of space, the axis of time, and then the axis of good and evil, which I see as being almost an orthogonal axis of time, perpendicular to time, but representing what Plato called the world of forms. Basically, when Earth was without form and void, when it was pure chaos, that's what's called evil. And God is the ultimate good, the ultimate order, the ultimate unification of all things, their perfection. God is the perfection of all things. And in God, all things are perfect. So these 2 ends, one of them is God, and one of them is completely unordered raw material. And as things progress from less orderly forms to more orderly forms, or like the world of Platonic ideals, um, you can sit on a rock and call it a chair, but you can also carve a chair out of wood, and the chair that you carved out of wood is of a higher form in the world of ideals than the rock, even though they're both of the same formal nature in that you use them for sitting, etc. Their purposes are identical, but their their suitedness to that, the perfection of their form is different. And at the end infinite point, um, at the point where we reach God, all forms would be of their most perfect nature, which is unified into one great, all powerful, all seeing being. Um, that's the traditional interpretation, at least. So, an interesting thing when we look at these spectrums of these five dimensions is that the they start with in a finite dimension. We can say there this is the endpoint and this is the endpoint. But when we're talking about infinity, we are moving these endpoints out until they approach infinity, and at the limit where they approach infinity, they actually come back and meet. At the infinite point, all lines converge. And so what we really have is if we draw a line out infinitely at the infinity point, at this direction and this direction, um, it will actually loop back and form a circle, just an infinitely large circle. Uh, and then for each one of these five axes, you will have its own circle, and all five of those axes will converge at the infinity point, no matter what. Which is a truth that we see in Heraclitus, for example. He talks about enantiodromia, which means a thing runs to its opposite. It's a Hermetic principle as well, that there's a polarity of things, but a thing, when it becomes sufficiently positive, flips and becomes negative. Thing which becomes sufficiently negative flips and becomes positive. This is also seen in a sine wave. When it goes and reaches its peak, it will naturally go down to its trough, to peak, trough. And this is the principle, the Hermetic principle of vibration. Uh, all of these things are intrinsic to this figure, which is presented to us by trying to numerically analyze Genesis by saying, okay, well, there's 10 times God says something. There's 22 times he does something else. That's 32 times total. There's 10 letters. For Hebrews, there's 22 letters in Hebrew. There's 10 numbers that we should be worried about in the Tetractys, um, that make up these 32 paths by which all things in the universe can be created. Uh, which, as the Sefer Yetzirah tells us, God created with three books, three Sephirim, and with text, the alphabet, with number, these 10 numbers, and with communication, their ability to be expressed, the Torah. So, thank you for joining me. I hope that you were able to take something from this and it wasn't too dense. I'm gonna, I don't really. I like to say that I feel like I know less than Socrates, who famously knew nothing. Um, it the more you study, the less for sure you know about anything. But but my goal here today was just to try to give you some inspiration for your own studies, um, not to try to impart any dogmas or anything, but to try to give you a some some inspiring insights that might guide your own research. Uh, right now, I'd like to take the time to uh, take the time to answer some questions. If you guys have any questions, um, feel free to ask them now in the Discord, and I can go over them, or we can wrap up. Oh, yeah. So this is the Bahir. Um, the Bahir is one of the oldest books in the Kabbalah canon, basically. Technically, I suppose mythologically or legendarily, the Sefer Yetzirah is older, but the Bahir is uh, I think it was Isaac Ben Luria's students wrote this, and it's a record of basically questions and answers to rabbis about Kabbalah subjects. It has some really fascinating stuff in it. For example, the uh, very beginning of it says, brings up these verses. One verse states, "And now they do not see light. It is brilliant, but here in the skies, round about God in terrible majesty." Another verse, however, states, "He made darkness his hiding place." It is also written, "Cloud and gloom surround him." This is an apparent contradiction, but then a third verse comes and reconciles the two. It is written, "Even darkness is not dark to you. Night shines like day. Light and darkness are the same." Um, Interesting stuff with ramifications to Genesis, as we were looking at. Then the three books that the Bahir, the Sefer Yetzirah, and then uh, Manly P. Hall's The Secret Teachings of All Ages. Just a veritable tome that is covers pretty much an overview of almost every occult subject. Um, there's a nice picture of Pythagoras there with his tetractys, his pyramid, his diagram of his theorem. I highly recommend that book. But all of these books are really great. Do you guys have any more questions? Hmm. Um, I think that Zohar asks, "I'm trying to find good books on the Kabbalah, but I cannot seem to find a complete centralized text. What text would you recommend for beginners and intermediate?" I think that one of the uh, one of the best books was written by a guy named Gershom Scholem. I can spell that out in the chat, but that Gershom Scholem, he wrote, I think it was called modern. It was either Modern Trends in Judaism or Modern Trends in Kabbalah, and it was basically one of the foundational modern texts, modern scholarship concerning the Kabbalistic traditions. Uh, if you were to just, I mean, this book is not necessarily easy, but um, if you were to buy just one, I would say this one, because Kaplan's commentary is just it's just perfect. It's great. It's fantastic. He was a genius, I think, and it covers so many subjects and is so easy. easy to relate to all of these things. I think he wrote a series of books on Kabbalah, and he wrote a book called Meditation in Kabbalah, which is great. I think that's in the MediaFire library that we have on the resources and books channel. By the way, if anyone's just seeing this on, if anyone is just watching this on YouTube, we have a Discord channel, and I think if you're a like-minded person, especially if you made it this far and watching this, I would invite you to come join. Maybe I'll put a link in the description um, with Zohar's permission. So, uh, yeah, it's a really fascinating subject. I hope to do another lecture soon, kind of expanding on some of these ideas, because really it could be talked about forever. It's that's why there's entire schools devoted to it, and there are practical applications for everything that I was just saying in terms of meditation practices, uh, occult magical practices to try to align your will with God's will. I mean, the Kaplan's text here goes on somewhat about how the permutations of alphabetic of the Hebrew alphabet were used to create golems, things like that. Just really pretty obscure esoteric stuff, but just fascinating. Um, all right, well, thank you guys very much for having me and for asking me to do this lecture. And if there's no other questions, I guess I will finish this up. You're welcome. It's my pleasure. Uh, maybe in another week or two, I'll do another one.